Sons of Devils, Chapter 9, in which Stefan is unwelcome at his own wake. "We were going to send for you." Ecaterina's father met her at the door of Stefan's room, his generous frame looking soft and helpless, his face sallow. He ushered her inside, with a hand in the small of her back, and she didn't know if the feel of it was comforting or fretful. Her own body felt strange to her, and the glamour held on top of it weighed her down like a coat of beaten gold. "But did it help? A few hours away? Do you feel a little stronger?" She felt sore, as though having exposed her grief to strangers, they had driven its sharp edges further in. But father looked so much in need of something soothing that she could not say so. It was good to meet 3 new talents, one who may be something remarkable in time. Sinking to the edge of the bed, opposite her mother, she took Stefan's other hand. The thing in the bed didn't really look like him. It was shriveled, chill and sallow. A part of her wanted to run from it, even hit it, because she could still recognize his features in it, and it was wrong, impossible for this silent thing to be her vibrant brother. It made everything else feel worthless, made her look back on an afternoon talking with fatuous people about unimportant petty little mysteries with utter self-contempt. How could she still be wasting her time with anything that wasn't Stefan? Mother turned a terrible, gentle smile on her. "The priest came while you were out. He is innocent, absolved, ready to leave." Thence came the smell of attar of roses, she thought, tightening her grip on a hand that was curling up into a claw. Stefan showed no sign he was aware of her touch, his eyes half closed, only the eyeball showing beneath the slit, the breath rasping, slow and laboured from his fallen mouth. Sunshine through the windows, and sounds of crows fighting on the lawn outside. They had been told to keep him warm, so a fire crackled in the grate, and the whole room was golden orange from the mingled lights. Eiderdowns of tawny velvet and coverlets of fur were heaped on top of him, every richness, every mark of royalty, and it didn't count, any of it. They were as weak before death as any peasants. Father knelt by her side, and as she had claimed Stefan's hand, he grasped the boy's arm, too hard to be anything but painful. Stefan didn't seem to notice, though his breaths came slower, shallower. "Don't!" Mother had noticed it too, leaned forward urgently. "Don't go. You're too young. You've too much still to see and do. Stay with us, darling, please." It seemed unfair to have guilt be the last thing his family gave him. "Shh," Ecaterina whispered fiercely. "It's all right. If you have to, you have to. We'll be all right. Don't worry about us. We love you. Go if you must." He didn't seem to be listening, didn't seem to be conscious at all, but she thought perhaps he'd heard. His breathing roughened, his brows twisted, and his body jerked as if he was trying to sit up. A rattle in his throat. They eased him back down again, and no more breath came. Silence. All 3 of them waiting for something, waiting to know what to do. Ecaterina wasn't ready to cry yet, but she found she had lost all tolerance for lying. She only wanted real things here in this terrible place. What was the point of beauty, after all? She dropped the glamour, the command to love me, I'm perfect. She saw her father, dry-eyed, looking at her with shock. Her mother, across the tableau of corpse, give an understanding laugh. Magic lessons and unearthly beauty. I should have put the 2 together a long time ago. She rose, composed and in control, except for the numbness around the edges of her smile. "I am glad to see your true face again, darling. We shouldn't keep secrets from each other." Ecaterina hadn't been thinking clearly enough to fear her parents' rejection. It had seemed obvious to her that they, of all people, would know she was the same person she always had been. She was justified in that, because there was barely time to feel the startled jab of fear before her father's hand was once more gentle on her back, absolving her of the deceit before she'd even had time to feel it. Mother opened the door, and in a firm, calm voice summoned in the priest to keep guard over Stefan's soul while it remained unanchored here on earth, devoid of a shell to house it. Ecaterina did not wonder at her mother's lack of grief. She was a boyarishna, as Ecaterina was herself, dignified, strong and fearless. She would not weep until she was alone. Ecaterina bit her lip to make sure she did the same, but allowed herself to lean into her father's bulk and slip her arms around his waist and hug. His presence, at least, was not hollow, as the rest of the world had become. He even smiled at her. But when the safety, the sense of being a child again, betrayed her into hitching breaths, the beginning of tears, he took her by the arms and set her upright on her feet, away from him. "Don't distress Stefan now. You know he still sees you. Save the weeping for the funeral, when we send him to his new home." He brushed 2 fingers reverently over the birthmark on her face. "I missed this. I know that a woman will always be as beautiful as she can manage, but I'm glad you chose to share this with us again. You are right to trust us." Sighing, he pulled his overrobe forward on his shoulders, looked down on his son's face, his expression weary beyond enduring. "But wear the glamour for our guests when they call to say goodbye to Stefan. They have loved the illusion. They may not take well to losing that too." She did try. Truly, she tried until a vein burst in her nose and the headache forced her to lie down in the marble entry hall with her forehead pressed to cold stone. Easy as it had been to remove, she just could not put it back. Her soul seemed to revolt from it, from being admired and courted and flattered by men who should be paying attention to Stefan. If she could have done, she would have become invisible instead. Incorporeal, indeed. She would have flitted through the corridors of the house and kept Stefan's exiled soul company while he said goodbye to all he had known. Her father, as always, proved wise. After the postelnik, the chief minister of the prince's court, reacted to her changed face with incredulity and barely veiled insult, she had tried to stay away from the guests altogether, but that too caused offence. Aware that she was failing her parents in their time of need, she tried harder to reapply the spell, but it carried on slipping through her fingers, a sly, happy little fish in a golden pond of feelings that she could not yet reach, numb as she was. By the time of the funeral, a week later, even those who hadn't seen had heard. Though her father was too important to shun, those who came to the service were cold and stiff with him, and having stared at her true face as though they had never seen anything so ugly, they would not even speak to her. They filed past at the graveyard. Curt courtesies, hurried and short. She clung on to her father's arm and tried to say, "I'm sorry," with every fingertip bruise. The earth was being smoothed and covered in flowers when her mother's control finally broke. She hurled herself onto the grave, sobbing in great breaths that seemed to scour her throat and break her ribs. My son! Now you have left us and all our light has gone out. What are we to do without you? What can I do?" Father threw himself down beside her, and for a moment Ecaterina felt unmade by panic, left all alone on the wooden slope of an empty hill, the only 2 people left who loved her, preoccupied by the dead. "I am sorry, truly sorry for your loss." She jumped, startled. It was the first voice to have addressed her in a week, and she hadn't known until then how very much she did not want to be invisible after all. blinking tears from her eyes, she found the new man, Vacarescu, her father's latest project. Looking at her with such horrified sympathy, it almost looked as if he was afraid. It was not a look that sat well in his polished steel eyes. He didn't have the face for self-doubt or even pity. You didn't even get the chance to get to know him," she said, her voice creaking with disused and restrained sobs. "No, I would have liked to see this horse of his go riding together. There are very few people in this place not playing their own games, but I don't think he was." "Is that aimed at me?" She wasn't angry with him. Shouldn't be angry with him. He was, after all, the only one who was talking to her. But that meant he was the only one making himself available to be angry with. His fault, then, that he was standing in for all the rest. He breathed a little humorless laugh through his nose. "I've never seen you in any other way than I see you now. But I hope that, even if I had been dazzled by whatever it was you did, I would not have been so ungenerous to shun you on the day of your own brother's burial." She should not blame her gift for being slippery and ungovernable. All her emotions were the same at the moment, her anger turning back against herself. "I fooled them into thinking me beautiful. They shamed themselves in pursuing me." This time the laugh was more definite. Cynicism suited him better than sympathy. "They were only telling me recently how beautiful Mademoiselle Giroux was, in her horsehair wig and her whalebone skirts, and a face so thickly painted with lead white she might have been wearing a mask. Why resent a little glamour on top? You say that because it didn't affect you. You can afford to be dismissive. I can." He looked pleased with himself, and that was even more his style. Smug. She didn't think she should like him for it, because I am not a pompous, self-absorbed, weak-willed fool like some I could name. It startled her into laughter, too, and the fact that she could still laugh surprised her. "That is unfair," she said, smiling. "But welcome. Thank you. You will tell me if there's anything I can do." There was a feast to return to. All that anger and grief and alcohol in the same place. But she wouldn't have to be present for all of it, and hopefully respect for the dead would prevent too much unpleasantness. Father had already been at work, spreading soothing platitudes to those who would listen, getting the servants to talk to his neighbours' servants, fighting insult with pity. If you were a young girl and you looked like that, wouldn't you want to cover it up too? She supposed that since she had earned contempt, she could bear it. "If you would tell those who complain of me that I fooled my parents too, that my father was not complicit in the deception. I never imagined that he could be harmed by this, that anyone could." "Of course." Vacarescu bowed over her hand as though nothing at all had changed. She supposed that for him it hadn't. But then he hesitated again, and a hint of the emotion she had seen at first, the thing that looked almost like shame, surfaced in his reassurance. "And if there is anything else, call on me." She thought of the offer later that night. So much later that the eastern sky was beginning to turn from charcoal to pewter. The wake had gone very much as she feared, as the drinking worsened and the ladies found excuses to leave. She had retired to her room early, but the noise of bellowing and later the crashing and thudding of furniture kept her awake. Early on, her mother had sat with her, saying very little, but combing her hair and plaiting it for sleep, as she had sometimes done when Ecaterina was a child, and upset with her nurses. Later, as the last of the carriages rolled away, her father had come with reassurances that he was still alive, having avoided a dozen challenges to duels, and negotiated a number of new truces. "The worst is past," he'd said, and taken Sander away to sleep. So Ecaterina was sitting by her window, and gazing out at a garden where only last week goddesses had walked among the shrubbery, and pegasi flown over the trees. There were still paper butterflies caught on some of the rose thorns, and mirror shards reflecting the bright moon. A strange landscape in the dark. The statues gained an air of potential life. The shadows under the pergolas seemed just waiting for her to turn away. Then they would slide out and move and colonize the bright places. She was just convincing herself her garden was full of inchoate horrors when one of the bright patches did move. Afar off toward the road, something pale was walking. She strained to see, and yes, it was an old man in old-fashioned clothes of white silk, with a long silver beard and silver glittering around the crown of his tall hat. He might have been one of the mourners. He was well dressed enough for nobility, but she couldn't place him. And surely at this hour a mourner would be walking away, not towards the house. There was something uncanny about the way he moved, she thought. A fluidity, as if his bones were not entirely solid. Graceful, but not quite human. He had a shadow that did not move in tandem with him, and was darker than a moon shadow had any right to be. Hackles she didn't know she possessed stirred along her spine at the sight of him, her magic recognizing something wrong. He stepped onto one of the paths lined with white gravel, and the moon shone doubled in the fountain behind him. The silver man almost disappeared against that black backdrop, but his shadow was revealed, and it was not a shadow at all, but a boy, tall but gangling, his auburn hair the colour of dried blood in the darkness, his rich purple robes black. She didn't need more light to know that they were brocaded all over with a background of golden roses. She had smoothed them down only that morning, when his body lay gently decaying in the heat of the church, the coffin open for his friends to say goodbye. There was a long, blessed period of disbelief before she found herself on her feet, hand pressed to the window, lips numb, face tight, and her heart shaking her body like an earthquake. Pain in her chest was nothing at all compared with the titanic flood of denial and fury and disbelief that tried to burst her soul. Stefan had come to his own wake. He had been dead. She knew this. His eyes had sunk, the tips of his fingers had turned dark, he had smelled sweet and offensive as his cheeks began to puff up, and she'd had to wave the flies off. He had been dead for days before going into the earth. No doubt about that. No tragic possibility of being buried alive, such as she had read happening in other countries who disposed of their corpses indecently fast. He was dead, and he was looking up at her window with puzzled eyes. She caught his gaze. An ice lanced through her, made her throw herself to her feet, slam the shutters, back away, and stand planted against the further wall, breathing like a bellows. That was not her brother. She should feel outraged, violated on Stefan's behalf. She didn't. She was altogether subsumed in something more primal, the freeze and then the kick to act of a man confronting a wolf. There was nothing of Stefan in the thing. Something cold was wearing him, so cold it made Vacarescu's chilly smile seem like a hearth fire. And was it not odd that it reminded her of him? Why should it do so, when he was so clearly just a man? Gathering herself, she picked up the icon of St. Michael, which stood in the corner of her room, clutched it to her like a breastplate, and forced herself back to the window. Fingers tight around the shutters, wound up to throw them closed again, thrust the holy thing into any unwelcome face, she edged the right one slightly open. She peered. There was nothing in the garden that ought not to be there. She still took her lantern, tipped down to the kitchen, and returned to rub garlic and salt around her window. Her parents were asleep. She could hear her father snoring through the doors. So she crept into their room and did the same for them, around the door too when she left, and around her own when she returned to her room. She was an educated woman, and she had learned from her friends the witches that at least 3/4 of folk magic was nothing more than play acting to overawe the superstitious. But some of it was true. She might simply be seeing things brought on by guilt and grief and sleeplessness. If so, she would suffer garlicky rheums for the night. But if she had just seen a strigoi, perhaps 2 of them, outside her house, it was better to be safe than to be proud. She could test the matter tomorrow, and she knew just the skeptic to take with her to be sure. Chapter 10, in which vampire hunting proves a contentious subject. The business of the Banat still reached Radu even in Bucharest, letters arriving with the morning post from those he had left in places of stewardship over the running of his castle, his animals, crops and villages. They dealt with the paperwork in shirt sleeves, Frank summarising the letters, Radu pacing and dictating, Frank writing. It took half the time it had once taken Radu alone. Secretary had been an inspired lie. Business concluded with breakfast. Frank left to visit Bogdan Ilionescu, who had offered to teach him more of what the Bucharest mages had already learned. It left Radu alone, but for a footman in his alcove, doing his best to blend in with the rest of the furniture. Radu went out to the balcony and looked out over the garden to the small memorial chapel where his parents lay. It had now been a fortnight since he'd seen them, and he was beginning to miss them. They were monstrous and overbearing, and he knew they would kill him gladly once he had given them an heir. Still, he'd rarely passed a night before without speaking to one or the other, mostly both. He even found himself worrying that something might have happened to them. Perhaps the soil in the little chapel was too consecrated. Perhaps they had met with a priest or a holy man who had put an end to them. Or perhaps Bucharest had its own strigoi, older than they, who had put them down, as his parents did with any new bloodsuckers on their own territory. He should have checked before this. He would check tonight. He would sit by their shallow graves until they returned, and make them speak to him. Strange how you could think you hated someone all your life, and then when you were free of them, you could find yourself wanting them back. When he returned to his study, he found the housekeeper had brought in a pot of coffee, and the footman had been exchanged for the Roma girl, Mirella. She looked ridiculous, standing to attention in her thick peasant clothes, and waved to him as though she knew it herself. He had to laugh at the impudent little gesture, because he found it strangely hopeful that her people had been slaves for centuries, and still retained so much self-will, so little subservience. It should have been galling, but he liked it. "Since apparently you could choose anything," he asked, "is footman your best option?" "It means I get to stand around all day being ornamental, and pocketing tips for opening doors," she grinned. "It's a good job. I'm fine with it if you are." He didn't like being coatless in a room with her. She could not stand still in the alcove, but moved in a constant slight undulation, bending her knees, swinging her hips. On others it must have looked like fidgeting. On her it looked as if she was moving to a drum beat, vivid and sensual, and just a touch mocking. "What tribe are you from?" "Bardi." She thought for a while, and then conceded, "My lord." The Bardi were entertainers, acrobats, sometimes, like the Lautari, musicians and dancers. He should have guessed. "What am I to do with you, Mirella of the Bardi?" She shrugged one shoulder. "I don't know. Nothing." You followed me all this way and you have no plans at all." Her happy-go-lucky smile twisted into anger. "Your monsters demanded a girl from my village and they sent me. They've all run away now, afraid of what you might do to them if you found out you'd been sent me in disguise. I'd like to go home, but my home isn't there anymore. I want my family, but I don't know where they are. Even if I was to find them, you're the lord. I'm the slave. You make the plans. You told me to wait and speak to you, so I'm here speaking to you. Now you tell me what to do next." He sat back at his desk, easing his hands out of fists under cover of the tabletop. She was fierce and frightened enough without knowing how much she wanted to smack her for that. And she was right, of course. His parents' plans for her had not included her surviving his rejection. She was a sacrificial victim who had got up again after the ceremony and said, "Well, what now?" He didn't know either, but it was not his place to admit it. His place was to take responsibility, even for, perhaps especially for, his parents' loose ends. "Then you may remain a footman for now, and I will consider to what better use so talented a shapeshifter may be put for later. You will receive a footman's salary. Where have you been sleeping?" "In the hayloft of the stables, lord." "The housekeeper will assign you a room of your own in the gatehouse." He wrote a terse note to that effect. There would be gossip, of course. It was rank favouritism. But if Mirella continued in the guise of a young man, he could hardly put her among the female servants, and it was out of the question to put her among the men. "You will accompany Mr. Carew whenever he attends Mr. Rescue's salon, and improve your knowledge and use of your talent, and you will hold yourself in readiness to use that talent in any way that I command." "Yes, lord." This smile had the sharp edges smoothed a little. Her braced shoulders came down, and lines of tension he had not realized were there eased around her mouth and brow. He had not truly done anything except confirm the status quo, but it was a relief to have that loose end tidied into a new place. It seemed it was a relief to her too. "Go stand outside the door. I can't have you fidgeting in here, it's distracting." She grinned at him again, bright and cheerful, as though he had actually done something good, before disappearing, and he walked back out onto the balcony to feel the strengthening sun, with a feeling of achievement. Like most houses in Romania, this had a closed, windowless ground floor of sturdy stone. The balcony stretched all around the second floor, forming a colonnade onto which chairs could be taken in the summer's heat, to sit in a shaded place and catch the moving breeze. Radu looked down onto the river valley, where long reeds and sullen pools were the only evidence of a drying Dambavita. There was a blue haze under the distant trees, and the lazy whine of mosquitoes. He walked meditatively around the house. Turning the corner gave a vista of more parklands, more sculpted gardens and formal flower beds, and a honey-coloured villa in the distance surrounded by beeches. Plague. His thoughts returned to it whenever there was nothing to distract them. It was hard to look at such beautiful views, Bucharest rising up against the sky in forested swells, interrupted by white churches and red roofs and the heavy fortified walls of monasteries, and imagine death in the streets. He breathed in, trying to loosen the weight that always rested on his lungs. Bucharest had always had plague. Every city in the world had the plague. He was jumping to conclusions if he thought this was his fault. It might yet not be. It might prove to be illness, some act of God, not something he had brought with him in the back of a wagon, hoping against hope that reason and self-restraint would guide them as it had in the mountains. It might not be his fault. Around another corner, and he could see the footbridge that gave a shortcut across the river to anyone prepared to walk out of town. A woman under a parasol stood at the highest point of its slender arch. The pink silk gleam of the fabric was dimmed under a layer of black gauze, and her dress was like crow wings, even her lace black as ancient dust. As he watched, she resumed walking toward the house. He couldn't see her face beneath the sunshade, but guessed well enough who would be walking toward him under a veil of heavy mourning, alone. He ducked back into the house to put on a better coat, found a hat, and hurried downstairs to be in the hall when she knocked. Radu was not sure what impulse had driven him to rattle down the stairs in time to intercept the housekeeper as she opened the door. When he saw the stiff way she greeted Ecaterina, and with what reluctance she took the lady's card as if it might be bewitched, he was glad he had. He could substitute welcome for both of them. "Please, come in. Georgia will take your parasol." Thus instructed, the sour-faced woman couldn't do anything else, and he rather enjoyed compounding her defeat with a quick command to bring lunch to the dining room. "I was just about to eat. You will join me?" Ecaterina made a striking figure, with the long black veil covering her head and shoulders, proclaiming her grief while hiding her face. At his smile, she took the front corners of it and folded it back over the line of combs that held it firmly in place. She looked frankly appalling, with bruises of sleeplessness and lines of anxiety and grief added to her already average complexion. Even her good feature, those large expressive hazel eyes, were dimmed and bloodshot. Offering food had rather exhausted what he knew about human interaction. She was no peasant to be comforted for a family member's death with the gift of coins and a mass paid for at the local church. Leading her to the dining room, he pulled out a seat for her, while servants laid another place on the board and poured them both wine. "I take it the wake didn't go too badly, unless you're here to ask me to answer a challenge on behalf of your father." She sat as though she was containing several very sharp things, and the slightest movement would allow them to slit her open and burst out. Fortunately not. And now he had run out of things to say that would not "tell me all about your brother's symptoms," and "tell me you cut his head off and stuffed his mouth with garlic when you buried him." Silence. She opened her mouth, closed it again. He sipped his wine, heard the front door open, and then quick footsteps coming toward them. Frank came in, shrugging off his outer coat, with his hat in one hand and a great green tome in the other. "Oh, I do but apologize. I didn't realize you had company." He put the book on a sideboard, draped the coat over his chair, and sat, only then taking a double take at Ecaterina's wan face. "Mr. Retzku, is that you?" She laughed, a glass sphere of sound filled with hollowness. "It is. I will understand if you prefer me to leave." "Of course not." Bless his gentle heart, but Frank sounded appalled by the idea. Still he had not fawned over her, nor tried to court her, and Radu had warned him to expect it. "My dear, you don't mean people are blaming you even now?" "It's only now they've found out," she said, and shifted a little to allow the servants to place a light lunch of salads, cheeses, cured meats and breads on the table. "But it's not something I've ever done deliberately. I can see why it might trouble someone if I had woken one day and decided to fool the world, but it wasn't like that. The glamour developed as I grew. I didn't know I'd done it until everyone started treating me differently. Nor would I have stopped it if I'd known it would cause such trouble. Only with Stefan's death, something within me decided it wanted to be ugly for a while." "You're very far from that, I assure you." Frank ducked his head, as if embarrassed by his own chivalry. Radu and Ecaterina smiled at one another, agreeing to be charmed. "I don't care, really." Ecaterina pulled a bread roll apart on her plate, but did not eat. except insofar as it reflects badly on my father. If anything, it may attract more women to our circle. Even the ungifted can help with research and reading if they're willing. And it was amusing to have so many admirers, to always be the first to dance. But I think I'd rather have suitors who were interested rather than simply bewitched. There's always someone who will marry me for my money, after all. So if there is no challenge, and you're not in distress because of your transformation, why did you come? Not that you're not welcome. Frank gave him a stern look, as if he was being unfeeling, but he couldn't see any other way to come to the point as quickly. Ecaterina added stew to her plate of torn bread pieces, and began to cut it up very small, to a scent of pork and anise and paprika. You are fresh from the country, and however sceptical, I hope you will not laugh at me when I mention the strigoi. Being prepared didn't seem to make things any better in his case. Indeed, perhaps it allowed him to feel the full blow more quickly. It still may not be related, said the lying voice of his cowardice, but he ignored it, in favour of watching Frank's healthy colour turn grey. Frank set down his knife carefully, pushed his plate away. Radu carried on eating. This was not a problem that could be solved by going hungry. I will not laugh. I had meant to ask if the old protective customs are being kept up in burials in Bucharest, but it seemed tactless under the circumstances. I wish you had. She flung herself out of her seat, retreated to the mantelpiece, where she was not quite tall enough to see herself in the mirror. I saw Stefan last night in the garden, in the company of a nobleman I do not know. He seemed inhuman, a demon in the form of a boy, staring up at my window. Frank was looking at him, horrified, trembling. Radu was happy that the thin blade of guilt was driven out of him almost entirely by anger. Don't look at me like that. You are more to blame than I. I am not a priest, he said carefully. I am not sure what I can do. You can come with me to his grave, to watch. The black veil flicked like smoke behind her as she turned, fixed him with a glare. I can't tell you how many envious women and rejected men there are in the court who might have gone to a witch to put the evil eye on me. I might be seeing things because someone is trying to drive me mad. But you see through magic as if it wasn't there. If you see my brother rising from the grave, it will be because he is. After that, she sagged against the wall, slurring with tiredness. After that, I'll know what to do. Having finished dinner, they made plans. Frank ordered a large mortar and pestle sent up from the kitchens, and was grinding cloves of garlic and salt in it, made into a paste with fish oil. The stench made Radu's eyes water. Mirella told me they hunt by smell, Frank said, so I'd feel better if we put some of this on. If it's plague, it won't do any harm, but if it's the strigoi, it may persuade them that we're not worth snacking on. My own brother would not. Ecaterina cut herself off. Radu understood the impulse all too well, and hoped devoutly that she was right, but he wouldn't have bet his life on it. It was far more likely that if Stefan had been turned, then all she was to him now was meat. He scooped up 2 fingers of the stinking paste, holding back his own protests. My parents would not allow a fledgling of theirs to harm me. Did he know that? Best not to test it, perhaps. He and Frank had changed into dark clothes, the better not to be spotted by Bucharest's high society while lurking around the graveyard in the dark. And Ecaterina had insisted on going in the dark, rather than risk being spotted walking together at twilight. He supposed she was entitled to be shy of company at the moment, but he disapproved. Spreading the paste on hands and face, his nose burned and then went numb. After a little while, the mind shut down the smell and it became tolerable, but it was again another good reason to hope they would not run into acquaintances. "Are there weapons that will kill them?" Frank asked. "Should I bring a gun?" "Decapitation will slow them down." Radu tossed him a sword he had brought from the armory. "Do you know how to use it?" Frank drew, tested the fit of the handguard, the weight and balance of the curved blade. "Yes, this is fine. Similar to the blades I used for fencing practice. And I have my trick with summoning sunlight. They've run from that in the past." Radu buckled on his own sword, considered the possibility of wooden stakes, looking up at the slim veiled figure of his guest. "Would you feel able to walk away if someone was driving a lump of wood through your brother's body? He felt Frank look at him as though he'd said something callous, and huffed in black humour as a reply. This was him being thoughtful. Ecaterina stiffened, clasping her hands together tightly in front of her. "I hope so. I am generally not subject to sentiment. I don't know that I'd be able to do it myself, but I think I'd be able to allow you." "Very well." The kitchen had also provided a dozen sticks of firewood whittled to sharp points. "The plan is to hide by his grave, strike his head off as soon as he emerges, and use the pause while he's trying to recover to stake him, after which I suggest the body be burnt." Ecaterina swallowed hard, a little green around the edges, and Frank got that disapproving look again. "Are you sure you want to be there? We know him well enough to recognise him. You don't need to put yourself through this. We can deal with it and then report back to you tomorrow." Frank wasn't sure how the glamour could have been an improvement on her naked bravery. She set her stubborn jaw. "He's my brother. I have to be sure." "But," said Frank, and that was going too far. There was sympathy and then there was disrespect. "Enough!" Radu handed the stakes and a mallet to Ecaterina to carry. He and Frank would need their hands free, and ushered her out into the dark. "She's right." They walked across the footbridge in silence, past shuttered shops and quiet houses, the many cheerful colours of their plasterwork muted in the dark. Upper stories leaned close over the rough pavement and dusty dirt of the street, turning paths into tunnels. Strings of drying washing and window boxes of trailing plants hung down in cascades of darkness, the buildings standing too close to one another to see the stars. From one of the upper windows came the sound of quiet, inconsolable weeping. Across the city, in the stillness of the night, someone screamed, sounding like the yowling of foxes. It had been hot during the day. The night was cold. When they came out of the narrow streets into the graveyard, its enclosing wall was creaking as the bricks cooled. The carved monuments and the stone angels whispered as they settled. The ribbon of the Milky Way above them pulsed with light, and the moon glared. Stefan's grave was up high amid solemn yews, in a little family vault whose entrance was mourned over by a carved woman with her cloak pulled over her face. But down towards the tanneries, where the graves bore only wooden crosses, a long, low shape surrounded by scaffolding billowed in the breeze. Radu crossed himself, seeing it. It was a pit, covered with tarpaulin, shallow-filled. When the wind gusted that way, the smell of decomposition followed it, making him glad for the garlic. A plague pit. He shouldn't be glad, he reminded himself. He reminded himself firmly he should not be glad that so many people were dying of illness that they could not be decently buried. But he was glad. Because if there was truly plague in the city, then there was still a chance that none of this was his fault at all. The doors of the Starescu mausoleum were closed. "It's still sealed," Ecaterina noticed, stepping out into the moonlight to check. Which means nothing, Radu told her, unable to tell if she had sounded hopeful or dismayed. They can come out as mist. It just means we can't go in to check whether he's there. We should have come earlier. They'll be abroad by now. Then we'll catch them on the way back. Frank mediated the argument as he had earlier. He had found a sheltered spot beneath one of the yews, the trees living presence adding some warmth to the night. When Radu sat beside him, he could see the doors of the mausoleum and the better part of the graveyard beyond, a good vantage point. Conceding that it was not worth having the argument again, Radu drew his sword and settled down to wait. It was odd being out at night at the best of times. Tonight a sense of cathedral silence came over him, the world and his heartbeat slowing. Cold bit his hands and feet and his exposed face. He thanked God he had no imagination, as the slow hour before dawn passed with a tread like bare feet on newly fallen snow. Even his breathing had grown quiet, meditative, when the first movement caught his eye, woke him from a state of daze. Dew was falling thick around the stones, white as a mist underfoot, faintly reflecting the stars' light. It billowed now around solid shapes. He nudged Frank beside him, and Ecaterina on the other side, but they had seen it already, hands over their mouths to hold in curses. As he peered harder, he could see not one slim boy, but dozens of dark silhouettes streaming through the graveyard's gates. Dozens of dark walkers silently shambling back to squeeze beneath stones, claw into newly turned earth, sated for the moment, putting themselves back to sleep. The stream that headed for the plague pit turned his stomach. They folded back the tarpaulin carefully and buried down through wet earth and bursting bodies like a man returning to his bed. He could see the hands moving like white spiders on the surface, drawing the thin soil over them. At last came Stefan Storescu, with blank eyes and a smudge of blood in the corner of his mouth, and Radu's father with him, a hand on his shoulder. It was so like the old bastard. So like him to work out the absolute worst thing he could possibly do and then flaunt it in Radu's face. That he didn't wait to feel shame or disappointment or even horror. He went straight to fury, roaring like molten brass. He stopped thinking and hurled himself out of hiding. They had their backs to him, watching the sky pale over the distant hills. One swift heroic cut, all the power of his rage in his arm. Stefan was still half turning toward him when the sword bit through the vertebrae of his neck. He tried to slow. Radu wrenched it all the way through. The head fell, hit wet grass with a slow well of blood from the throat like the overflow of a sink. "I thought you were my friend," it whispered. Constantin was staring at him, shocked. "Good. Ecaterina, the stakes!" Nothing. Frank and Ecaterina sat unmoving, frozen into statues by his father's command. He couldn't think about that. There was no time. He just grabbed a short length of hazel shaped into a spear from the girl's lax hands and kicked Stefan's still upright body in the knee. The boy fell, and Radu threw himself on top, pinning him with a knee in the stomach. How to get thick but brittle wood through the ribs up into the heart? Not through the breastbone, clearly. He shoved the tip of it through the belly, angled it up beneath the ribs, not thinking about the body thrashing beneath him or the wet yield of tearing flesh, not thinking of anything, until suddenly something gave. A rush of cold fluid spurted over his hands, and the creature went limp under him. The whispering head fell silent. Constantin took a step backwards, as Radu looked up at him, and it made him grin and wish for wolf's teeth to bare. The old man was afraid of him. Wasn't that something? "You and I will have words." But Constantin looked over his shoulder again, to where the tips of the nearest cupolas were rosy with sunshine. "Because you killed a child. Yes, we will." and then he was gone, twisting through the morning haze like an eddy in the mist, untouchable and always with the last word. Radu laughed like a hyena until his ribs and throat ached with it, and only stopped when Frank put an arm around his shoulders and gingerly squeezed. He pressed his face into Frank's throat and held on until he had command of himself enough to stand up, allow himself to be drawn into a proper hug, warm and firm, stinking of garlic and fear. Quite possibly he didn't smell too good himself, with his arms wet to the elbow with the leakings of weak dead viscera. "How much did you see?" Frank sneaked a glance at Ecaterina, who stood with her back to them, leaning against the tree, her veil down and pressed into her face. "All of it. We couldn't move, but we could watch." He wasn't prepared to say "I'm sorry" to her. This was what they had come to do. He wasn't sorry. He wanted to throw up and then set something on fire. So he left her to mourn and walked to the doors of the mausoleum, using the hilt of his sword to smash the plaster seal with some satisfaction. There was a clean, dark chamber inside, with a row of chests for bones and a single marble slab where a new coffin lay empty. Picking up the corpse, he laid it on the floor, its head down by his feet. "We need to burn this, preferably before the city wakes up and finds it has new victims to bury." "This is my brother's body." Ecaterina had come to the door, her veil bunched around her fist. Her face was still invisible, but her voice hovered on the edge of hysteria. "Have some respect." Radu didn't have time for respect. He couldn't see how they could bring enough wood and kindling into the graveyard to dispose of the thing without being seen. So many strigoi, wobbly little fledglings though they were, meant as many new dead to bring to the plague pit, meant the gates would be thronged within hours of sunrise with funerals. They could hardly carry the corpse away, even wrapped in part of the tarpaulin, without being seen. But there were boxes along one wall. I could cut it into 3 pieces, put them in the chests, each carried one down to the house, and we could burn it there privately. Now Frank was holding him again, part reassurance and part restraint, with an expression in which horror and pity mingled. He wasn't sure why. He seemed to himself to be dealing with this quite calmly. "You'll do nothing of the sort." Ecaterina ripped the veil from her hair and covered the dead boy up with it, glaring at him. Frank murmured, "You don't have to do this alone. We'll tell someone. The Archbishop, the Voivode, everyone needs to know. Let Ecaterina and her family arrange it. Leave the body here, go home, and Ecaterina can tell her father that Stefan's safe now, but he needs a cremation. Then later, when we're cleaned up and you've had a drink, we can tell the bishops. They can do something about the other strigoi. You don't have to handle this all on your own." Radu's thoughts snapped back from plans to anger. "No, of course not. Of course they'll be able to do something, just as you two were. You just sat there, and that's what the bishops will do when it comes down to it. Nothing, because the strigoi won't allow it. I have to." Frank's right. Ecaterina had taken a deep breath, curling in on herself and then straightening out, like a fern greeting the morning. Her voice was stronger now. "You need to go home, wash, take a couple of drinks and calm down. My family and I will see to anything further that needs to be done for my brother." She gouged out a painful smile. "Thank you. As you say, I couldn't move. I couldn't have freed my brother from this curse without you. I shouldn't be angry. It was so much easier if she was, so that he could be angry in return, instead of any of the other alternatives." He didn't say so. He just leaned on Frank's arm. Hard to believe, but he did feel a little watery, as if he too was liquefying from within. I'm sorry, he managed now. It meant, I'm sorry for your loss. I liked the boy. I can't imagine what it's like to lose one of your family in such a way. I've always tried hard not to imagine it, in fact. But they were both wrong. It was up to him to sort this out, because he was the only one who could. He would do it single-handedly. He would sort out this mess that he'd made and drag his monsters home and put things right, no matter that he had no idea how. He allowed Frank to urge him to the door of the tomb, out into a paired pewter dawn, still breathing hard. His hand ached around his sword hilt, clenched hard enough to dent the metal. Ecaterina caught his sleeve as he passed, dropped it with a grimace, wiping the stickiness off her fingers. It was as if he knew you. That old man who was with Stefan. Despite his anger, there was still a little room for fear. The prospect of hanging he could possibly endure, that of beheading certainly, but there were crueler punishments. The thought of impalement made his skin crawl. Not that. Anything but that. I have books with pictures of him, he replied with careful truth. He's one of my ancestors, buried in a chapel in the gardens of my townhouse. Not what I was hoping to find when I came to Bucharest. How long have you known? He chose to take the question to mean, how long have you known that Constantin was responsible for all of this, and not, how long have you known your ancestor was a blood-sucking demon? I didn't. Not until I saw him just now. She sighed again, and tucked the loops of her hair more firmly into its combs. It looked strange, indecent, uncovered as it was, soft as her face had softened. I'm sorry too. So she was taking his outburst as a sign that he too was an innocent, horrified to find a monster under his bed. Good. And at least if you know where he's buried, you can go home and put him down, the way you did for Stefan. Yes, Frank agreed, gentle and blithe, as though he still didn't realise this was all his fault. He closed the mausoleum door behind them, got a hand in both their backs and pushed them back into the city. That's what we'll do. After a wash and a very large drink. Ecaterina, can you make your way home from here, or do you need us to walk you to the door? I'll have your hat, she said, more firmly now, the note of confident command creeping back. I can't be seen out of doors with my hair like this. Of course. He handed it over. They watched together, as stuffing all her stray hair up into it, she walked back to the Chancellor's house. Now I've seen you kill one of them, I know you can kill the others too. Frank was still tugging, Radu still not quite himself, when they crossed over the river into the sanctuary of his own grounds. Maybe you're the only one of us who can. You have to, Radu. We can't let this go on. It took him too long to realise that Frank was pulling him not toward the house, but out into the gardens, down to his parents' mausoleum. Only when he stepped in cautiously in reed bed, and felt the cold of marsh water envelop his foot, did he snap out of his fugue, look around himself, and gasp with something like betrayal. It was a modest little tomb, built on a platform of white marble, that, when the river ran high, overlapped the water's edge and made the whole thing seem to float. The family crest was carved over the white doors on a plaster seal that lapped over the join and held the entrance closed. Marigolds and marshmallows were in bloom around the steps of the white square, and herons had nested messily in the mock bell tower. A sound of paddling and cheeping nearby told of ducks with their fuzzy offspring hidden among the reeds, and from the distant road came a faint sound of something large moving. Many horses, many feet. Come on, Frank tugged at his drying sleeve, trying to get him moving again. Radu dug his heels in and scowled, Frank was very quickly running through the final stores of his patience. "Look, I'll do it myself then." The Englishman drew his sword, marched forward, back straight, brow furrowed in determination. Radu had barely time to feel a flash of protective panic before Frank had stopped, just below the first marble step. He looked over his shoulder, puzzled. "What did I say I would do?" Radu laughed again, with a laughter that tore like hooks. "Go in, Frank. Put an end to the Strigoi inside. Go on. Do it if you can." Frank turned back, made one more step, stopped again, and returned to his side, shaking his head. "I get close, and then I forget what I came to do." "Can they all do that, even the new ones?" "I don't know," Radu admitted. "My parents have never allowed others to arise on our lands. I can only imagine they've lost their heads, presented with a feast like Bucharest after so long fasting. Perhaps if I speak to them, they will understand this cannot go on." "Speak to them?" Frank was all aglow with righteous certainty. It looked beautiful on him. He would have made a good painted saint on a wall. "How many more of your friends will you let them kill before you do something?" "What do you expect me to do, Frank?" So this was how Frank repaid him for the sacrifice of letting him live. By adding salt to the wounds. "You expect me to kill my mother? I know what she is. I know what my father is, but they are still my parents. I owe them my life and my obedience, and more than that, I love them. I wouldn't weep overmuch if someone else was to kill them, but I can't. Do you understand me? I can't." Frank bared his teeth in a show of power Radu had never seen from him before. He'd got some pride back along with his memories, evidently. "But you're the only one who can, so you must." If he wanted to challenge Radu's authority, he could take the consequences. Radu put a hand in the centre of his chest and shoved hard, always surprised at how little Frank weighed, how easy it was to overpower him. "I must do nothing. Have you forgotten why we're here? We're here because coming here was the condition of them sparing your life. We stay here because every day we remain is a day on which they don't kill you. I did this for you, so you don't get to tell me what I can and cannot do. I will keep my parents and my lover alive. The rest of the world can go hang." Frank reeled back, arms windmilling as he fought to keep his balance. He ended up panting with fury, knee-deep in the reeds. "I offered to let you shoot me. I begged you to shoot me. It was your choice not to. Don't blame this on me." "Oh, so I must do all the killing that you are too weak-stomached to do." Frank stood with his mouth open, had an expression of such anguish that it made Radu want to slap him hard just to wipe it off. That's unfair. You don't know how difficult suicide is when you want to live." So self-absorbed. It was as though it had never occurred to him that Radu might have tried. "Do I not?" Startled out of his anger, Frank gave him a sharp, unhappy look, but kept to the point. "If I wasn't here to be in danger, would you take them back home?" "Wait until they were in their coffins. Paint the whole surface with garlic and salt, closing the lid down with iron locks. That might keep them contained enough to be returned to Berkey in a wagon, while Radu dealt with the fledglings here." Though he could hardly imagine how he was going to kill all the fledglings in one night. It could be done, perhaps. And he knew better now than to get attached to anyone whose survival could be used as leverage over him. He would be wiser next time. Yes. I would take them home and keep them there, whatever their wishes. "Then I have to leave. If you give me a fast horse, I might be able to get to the coast onto a ship before they find me. I might be able to get away." Radu's anger gave way under him, revealed despair, like a black, unfrozen sea beneath. They'll find you. They'll turn you and they'll bring you back here to mock me. Please don't, Frank. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I was angry, but I swore to save you. If you go, I won't be able to do that, but you'll be able to save everyone else. He had a martyr's look now, half resolute, half dazzled at the thought of his chance to play the hero. Part of Radu wanted to answer it by building a dungeon to keep him in, forcing him to stay, in chains if necessary. I'll let them all die if you leave. Frank smiled, oddly carefree, fond even. I don't believe that. You fucking pious hypocrite. You don't know anything. You don't know what I'm capable of. He charged forward, got Frank by the collar and shook him as they had done when they'd first met, helplessness making him angry again. I don't know it myself. Stars burst in the distance beyond him. That noise Radu had heard earlier was now a thunderous rumble, and the ground shivered beneath his feet. Frank looked up from where he dangled in Radu's grasp, and Radu set him carefully upright, looking out across the river to where the main road of Bucharest curved down toward the Black Sea. The road was full of marching soldiers. A full janissary company with standard-bearer and cauldrons and supplies, curvetting horses and bright saddle-cloths and gilded tack bright as the sun. Their distinctive headdresses lay over their heads like a draped sleeve, blinding white in the sunlight, and all their pikes glittered, and the bells on their scimitars jingled. We need to bathe and dress now. Radu tugged Frank back toward the house. The voivode will want his boyars in attendance for this, whatever it is, and I want you there. War against England. They were back in Starescu's lair at the palace. Solid walls and an aura of ancient strength were doing nothing to support Frank, who had sunk into a leather-upholstered chair by the fireplace, clutching a tot of tweaker in one hand and his hair in the other. Starescu himself, looking deflated beneath his rose-pink robe as though he hadn't touched food in weeks, sat equally heavily behind his massive desk. It was a mark of how his influence had waned following his daughter's exposure, that even in this crisis he was not among the ministers the voivode and the Sultan's ambassador had chosen to stay and talk strategy. It's all the more vital now that I must go home. What part of you will be hanged if you set foot in this country again? Did you not understand? Radu thought, remembering what Frank had told him of his father's parting words. But he couldn't say that here. We couldn't let you, Frank. You'd be shot as a spy before you got out of Bucharest. So many people here know you as that Englishman. Fond as I am of you, Starescu agreed, dull-voiced, dull-eyed. I would have to agree. You have heard enough of the voivode's counsel already for it to be treason for me to allow you to run back to an enemy with whom we are presently at war. I will have to ask you to give me your word of honour that you will not try it. He raised the listless gaze to Frank's as though it was infinitely heavy. I warn you that if you do not give it, we will have to imprison you until such time as the hostilities cease. You are a Christian country, Frank gaped, outraged. Why would you ally yourself with the Turks against us? It stings us too. Radu thought again of the casual superiority of the Ottoman ambassador, carried in so that his feet would not have to touch the floor. For hundreds of years they took our sons in the slave tax, ripping them from their mothers to fight their wars for them. That has ended, but using us as expendable armies has not. They call us and we come to heel like the dogs we are. And if you didn't? Frank fixed him again with that life is so straightforward when you're always on the winning side look. The one Radu firmly hoped he did not know was as self-righteous as it was. Over centuries, Starescu admitted sadly, we have tried to fight off this yoke. We have never succeeded. Each time we try, the tribute grows heavier. Time to acknowledge when we are beaten, I think. The idea came to Radu like a morsel of food breathed in instead of swallowed. It lodged in his mind unexpected, made him choke and then laugh with joy. Both of his companions looked at him as if he'd gone mad. He laced his fingers together and pressed them against his mouth to stop from guffawing. This was not the place. We still have to clear out the plague pit and all the graves before sunset, Frank reminded him. If you have any sort of city to come home to. Starescu tugged on his beard, looked at Radu this time with an eye grey as frog spawn. I have kept that matter discreet, but even Father Joseph of Plumbuita, who exorcised the demon from Antim Ivirienu, could not find it in himself to approach the place with intent to dig them out. He sighed so deeply that the candles in their lanterns by the door flickered. So I don't see what cause you have to laugh, young man. Give me your word, Frank, that you will not run off to alert your countrymen, or for any other reason, Radu said. He was trying not to be too triumphant prematurely. It might not work. Oh, but it will. In return, I give you my word that I have an idea that will fix all of this. The Strigoi, the war, I can put it all right. Frank glanced at Starescu as if to ask him what was going on. The Stolnik shrugged, looking almost as interested for the first time in the conversation. Frank's pale blue eyes flicked to the icon of St. Mary that stood in its niche in the corner, and thence to the tiny barred window just beneath the ceiling, as though seeking divine guidance. Very well, he considered at last. I swear not to leave your side except on errands I have agreed with you beforehand, and then I will return as expediently as I can. I will not attempt to leave, nor send any message to my countrymen until the war is over. On this I give you my word of honour. Good. Then come with me, and we will try this plan. You'll tell me of your success in some more detail, I hope, when you return. Starescu interposed his bulk between Radu and the door. Radu wasn't going to tell until he knew if it would work, and maybe not even then. Of course. I must ready my household to obey the Sultan, but I will return with good news, I hope, shortly after nightfall. That was chapter 9 and 10 of Sons of Devils by Alex R. Oliver, read by Galadir. The music was Gifts of Stars by Lloyd Rogers. Tune in next week for chapter 11 and possibly 12, I don't know. We'll find out. Thank you. See you then, I hope.